What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into our running back rankings for week 11 of the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content or find it helpful, hit that like button on the way in. And of course, hit that subscribe button if you are new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, so as we approach the week, we've got three teams on bye week. The Jacksonville Jaguars, so no Travis Etienne. The Miami Dolphins, so no Raheem Mostert or Jeff Wilson Jr., and no Tampa Bay Buccaneers running backs, including Rachaad White and Leonard Fournette. So it doesn't affect the rankings too poorly, but all those players are definitely starters or flex options at the moment at the running back position. So keep that in mind as we move forward in today's video. All right, number one overall, we've got Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants coming in as your RB3 overall in standard scoring formats and PPR scoring formats. Finished with 23 fantasy points against the Houston Texans in week 10, 152 yards on the ground. That was his second best rushing total of the year, a touchdown and just one reception in this game. But gosh, he's got another beautiful matchup this week against the Detroit Lions. I expect Saquon Barkley to have a huge day. Even though he's got one or two other guys ahead of him, this matchup alone moves him up a little bit in the rankings. All right, number two, I've got Austin Eckler, who at the moment is your RB1 in full PPR scoring formats. A little bit down week in week 10 against the San Francisco 49ers, who have a very stout run defense, but we know that Eckler is going to get it done through the air as well. Overall, he had 24 rushing yards, 12 targets, 7 receptions, 39 receiving yards, finished with 13.3 fantasy points. All things considered, against that Niners defense, not too awful, but he gets the Chiefs this week in what will be a competitive game script. We might see some receivers returning for the Chargers this week, and Mike Williams and Keenan Allen. And overall, when these two teams face each other, it is always a good matchup. It's a prime time game, so I like Austin Eckler. And with all that being said, the Chiefs have not played very well against the running back position so far on the season, so I like him at number two overall. Your number two running back overall at the moment in full PPR is going to be Christian McCaffrey, who had the Chargers in week 10, 17.7 fantasy points, all things considered, 38 yards on the ground, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 39 receiving yards. He was kind of struggling on the ground throughout this game. The Chargers really surprised us and actually decided to play well against the running back position for the most part, but we saw Eli Mitchell get pretty heavily involved with 18 touches on the ground, 89 yards overall, 4.9 yards per carry compared to Christian McCaffrey's 2.7 yards per carry. But ultimately, I'm not worried about Christian McCaffrey. Shanahan has come out and said that Eli Mitchell is going to continue to get touches, but that's just what Kyle Shanahan does. The upside still lies with Christian McCaffrey, especially in full PPR leagues. He will be the pass catching back, and he was still the running back who got the ball in the red zone. So I still like Christian McCaffrey against the Cardinals. Should be a competitive game script. I think that this Niners offense is actually going to continue to play pretty well and pretty balanced, so I like CMC. But yes, I get it. The touches to Eli Mitchell are a little bit concerning, but I'm still keeping the faith in Christian McCaffrey as we approach week 11. All right, Derrick Henry comes in as your RB5 overall in full PPR scoring formats, RB2 in standard scoring formats. He gets the Packers on Thursday night football. I never really liked Thursday night matchups, but this is a pretty important game for both of these teams. The Titans kind of fighting to stay as the number one team in the AFC South, and you got the Packers hopefully trying to make a comeback on their season after beating the Cowboys in week 10. Henry struggled against that Denver Broncos defense in week 10, 8.7 fantasy points, 53 yards on the ground, and added 2 receptions for 14 receiving yards, just 8.7 fantasy points, like I said, compared to the last 6 weeks where he's had between 16 and 35.8 fantasy points. But I think he'll bounce back against the Packers. And ultimately, if you own Derrick Henry, he's a start on a weekly basis, but he comes in as our RB4 for the week. Joe Mixon is coming in as your RB7 in full PPR after that monstrous performance in week 9 and having a bye week in week 10. He had over 55 fantasy points on average in week 9. We all know the story. 5 total touchdowns, 4 on the ground, 1 through the air. I don't think he's going to top that performance on the season, but ultimately it has moved him into the top tier conversation on the rest of the season. And ultimately he draws a better matchup than the next couple running backs on this list. So we'll have Mixon at number 5 overall for the week. Nick Chubb comes in as our RB6. He is your RB4 in full PPR, your RB1 in standard scoring formats at the moment. He only has 2 games this year where he has not scored a touchdown, but ultimately a pretty tough matchup still on paper against the Bills, even if Dalvin Cook got a little bit loose against them last week. I'll have Chubb just a little bit further back on the list, but I'm not going to be surprised if he has a great day against the Bills. But looking at the matchup, he comes in at number 6 overall. That is not to say that he is not playing phenomenal football right now, and he is absolutely in your lineups as we approach the week. Dalvin Cook had a monstrous week in week 10 with 23.6 fantasy points. That was his 3rd best fantasy performance of the season. 119 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 3 receptions for 27 receiving yards. I know this matchup on paper is not great against the Cowboys, but I expect this matchup to be competitive and to be a good game script from a fantasy perspective. And like we just talked about, he played well in week 10 against Buffalo, has been very good against a run on the season, and the Cowboys weren't that great last week defensively. So I like Dalvin Cook this week. I think he'll have a solid stat line. Josh Jacobs is playing very good football basically week in and week out. I know he kind of had his slump in weeks 8 and 9, finishing with a little bit of a lower ceiling, but he kind of bounced back in week 10, right? 22.6 fantasy points against the Colts, 78 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 28 receiving yards. He's your RB6 in full PPR at the moment, but he draws a tough matchup. Remember, we just talked about Derrick Henry not performing too well against the Denver Broncos. That is Josh Jacobs' matchup here in week 11, but keep in mind he had 34.5 points in week 4 against the Denver Broncos, so I'm not going to be surprised if he has a good game, but on paper he's moved back a little bit in the rankings. JT bounce back. I told you guys, if you own Jonathan Taylor, you have to at least flex him. You can't afford to not sit him when he is healthy. Yeah, he only gave you 5.6 fantasy points in week 8, but look what he did for you in week 10. 24.3 fantasy points, 147 yards on the ground, and a touchdown, as well as 16 receiving yards against the Raiders in week 10. I think he'll have another good week against the Philadelphia Eagles, who ultimately on the season have played well against the position, but as of late with some injuries, they're starting to kind of loosen up against the run. So I won't be surprised if JT finishes a little bit higher than some of the other running backs ahead of him on the list, but I like him ultimately at number 9 overall. Moving on to Alvin Kamara, our RB10 for the week. He comes in as your RB13 so far on the season. And I still like Alvin Kamara a lot, even though the last 2 weeks have been pretty rough. He's definitely struggled, but just the ultimate ceiling that Alvin Kamara brings still lands him as a top 10 running back, even in a steep matchup against the Rams as we approach week 11. Moving on to the next 10 running backs, we've got Aaron Jones at number 11 against the Titans. He's your RB8 in full PPR at the moment. It's a tough matchup. It's a short week, and Aaron Jones is limited at the moment. In fact, this is due to a shin injury that he suffered in week 9. He was a little bit banged up in week 10, but still had 23.6 fantasy points. Ultimately was able to play. 138 yards on the ground, a touchdown, and 2 receptions for 18 receiving yards against the Dallas Cowboys, who have played very well against the position. Ultimately, the issue here is it's a short week, A, and then B, it's still a tough matchup against the Tennessee Titans. So he's a little bit further back on the rankings. And if you are an Aaron Jones owner, we need to be monitoring this injury situation very closely throughout the week. There is a chance he does not suit up in this game. So ultimately, he's a little bit further back on the list. Dameon Pierce comes in as your RB14 so far on the season in full PPR. I've got him as RB12 going into week 11 against the Washington Commanders, who have actually played very well defensively. Well, maybe not very well, but better defensively as of late. In the last 2 weeks, Dameon Pierce has a ceiling of 13.9 fantasy points in week 10. He had just 12.2 fantasy points, which feels like a little bit lower since week 7. He has not scored more than 15.7 fantasy points, but let's face it, Double digits are still good from the running back position. He's a perfectly fine RB2 on a weekly basis. Finished with 94 yards on the ground and 2 receptions for 28 receiving yards against the Giants in week 10. Ultimately, what we need to see out of Dameon Pierce or more touchdowns overall. I like him against the Commanders. I still think you should fire him up as an RB2 or flex option as we move forward on the season. Next up on the list, we've got Ramondre Stevenson. May have forgotten about him. He was on bye week in week 10. He's had 16 or more fantasy points every game since week 5 of the season. And since week 3 of the season, he's had 12 or more fantasy points. He continues to be a start for me on a weekly basis. It is a tough matchup against the Jets, but overall in week 8, he had 21.3 fantasy points against the Jets, so I still like Stevenson. I won't be surprised if he finishes a little bit higher than some of these other running backs ahead of him. He's your RB10 in full PPR at the moment. He is still a solid option on a weekly basis. Next up, we've got Antonio Gibson, who draws a beautiful matchup against the Houston Texans. He did get a little bit banged up against the Eagles, but I haven't seen any serious injury reports come out for Antonio Gibson. He had 14.8 fantasy points against Philadelphia, 44 yards on the ground, a rushing touchdown, and 3 receptions for 14 receiving yards. Gibson is the running back that I ultimately like for the Washington Commanders, but Brian Robinson played very well against the Eagles as well from a fantasy perspective and just overall, actually. I mean, 86 yards on the ground and a touchdown, 14.6 fantasy points for Brian Robinson in week 10. I could definitely see both these running backs being very good flex options, and I still like them as flex options because they kind of limit each other's ceiling. So I do have Brian Robinson number 17 overall, but I do think that due to this matchup against the Houston Texans, who are one of the worst teams in the league against opposing running backs, Gibson and Robinson are both solid flex options as we approach the week, but they're a little bit apart on the rankings. I still like Gibson a little bit more because he brings that PPR upside, that pass catching upside. All right, Cordell Patterson comes in as our RB15. He had an awful week against the Carolina Panthers Thursday Night Football in the rain. Just 5 touches on the ground, 18 rushing yards, and 1 reception. We'd like to see him bounce back in week 11 against Chicago. It's a good matchup. He should do so, but ultimately this backfield is kind of capped because there are so many options at the running back position. I'm going to give Patterson another opportunity here since he had 18.3 points in week 9 and a good matchup here in week 11. I'll give him another opportunity, but if he does not perform, we can definitely hit the panic button. All right, David Montgomery comes in as our RB16. He's been definitely playing downward as of late, but it's a good matchup against the Falcons, and it's not really Montgomery's problem or Herbert's problem. It's not them as players. It's just that Justin Fields is balling in terms of the run game at the quarterback position, which is really taking away value from a fantasy perspective from Montgomery and Herbert. But I still like this matchup for David Montgomery here in week 11 against the Falcons. Moving on, we got Miles Sanders a little bit further back on the list. He gets the Colts. I actually won't be surprised if Sanders has a good game and could definitely outscore guys like Patterson or Montgomery, but ultimately we saw a down performance for Miles Sanders in week 10 against Washington. 5.4 fantasy points, 54 yards on the ground. He had 3 touchdowns in his 3 previous games, so I won't be surprised if Sanders finishes a little bit higher than some of these other running backs like I said, but I could see a game script where the Eagles come out after the week 10 loss and just absolutely throw the football all over the place. So I love Miles Sanders. I still believe in him. I still think he's very consistent, but ultimately this offense kind of caps his upside unless they score a lot of points in the first half, and then the second half they just run the ball into oblivion with Miles Sanders and Kenneth Gainwell. So I still think Sanders is a good RB2 and or flex option if you need to play him this week. All right, I've got Tony Pollard a little bit further back on the list, but I do want to emphasize I really like Tony Pollard this week. He gets the Minnesota Vikings, who have actually really improved in terms of their run defense, but ultimately the reason I have got Pollard a little bit further back is because we don't know the status of Ezekiel Elliott for the week quite yet. Now, if Zeke is out for sure, I would probably have Pollard closer to the 11 or 12 range. Told you guys last week, I didn't even care if Zeke was healthy. I wanted you guys to fire up Pollard, and if Zeke did not play, which he did not. I really like Pollard as a start last week. If Zeke is out here again in week 11, I really like Pollard once again. But if Zeke does play, it's just going to cap Tony Pollard's ceiling at the end of the day. But in week 10, he had 21.8 fantasy points, a touchdown, 115 yards on the ground, and 3 total receptions for 13 receiving yards. Pollard is still a running back I like a lot, but it just kind of depends. Is Zeke going to play or not? I like this game script. Should be competitive. So Pollard is definitely a running back who can move up on my personal rankings as the week goes on. All right, Donta Foreman a little bit further back as well. Might surprise you guys. We've got guys like David Montgomery due to matchup and Cordero Patterson due to his matchup a little bit higher than guys like Sanders, Pollard, and Foreman who are playing good football right now. But at the end of the day, I'm looking at things like matchups and other running backs and previous performances and potential game scripts. And Donta Foreman draws the Baltimore Ravens in week 11. This unit is playing pretty well against the run, especially with the addition of Roquan Smith. Ultimately, I still like Foreman, but we also need to keep in mind Chuba Hubbard's starting to get healthy. Raheem Blackshear is still getting slight involvement at the end of the day, but Foreman is the lead back in my eyes. He had 19 fantasy points in week 10 against Atlanta, 130 yards on the ground, and a touchdown. He had 31 total touches, but this was a rain game. This was a game script where the Panthers wanted to pound the football, and they did so with success, and they just kept feeding Foreman, and I don't blame them, and that's part of why they won this game. Ultimately, in week 11, I don't know if they get that same game script at all. And then in week 12, they get the Denver Broncos. So these next 2 weeks aren't looking as promising for Donta Foreman, but I do have faith in him. And I do think he's a solid running back 2 or flex option if you don't have better options. But I'm a little bit worried with this potential matchup against the Ravens as we approach week 11. All right, moving on to our next 10 running backs. I've got Jamal Williams here as our RB21. Listen, guys, I also have DeAndre Swift as RB26, kind of far apart on the rankings, and ultimately these 2 running backs just cap each other's ceilings. The way that this offense is ran just caps both of these running back ceilings at the end of the day. But I like Jamal Williams slightly more. I just always feel like he's a little bit of a safer bet for a touchdown, although DeAndre Swift saved his fantasy stat line to some degree in week 10 with a touchdown. Jamal Williams had 11.9 fantasy points. That's 3 weeks in a row with 10 or more fantasy points with a ceiling of 22.6 fantasy points, 59 yards on the ground, and a touchdown for Jamal Williams in week 10. He does draw the Giants, though, who have played well against the running back position on the ceiling. And with, DeAndre Swift as a factor, he's a little bit further back on the list. All right, James Conner is playing really good football right now, but he gets a stout matchup against the San Francisco 49ers in week 11. So he comes in as our RB22, but he had 23.6 points against the Rams in week 10, who have played well against the running back position on the season. 69 yards on the ground, 2 touchdowns, and 3 receptions. If Conner plays well enough in this game, he'll probably move up pretty significantly on the overall rankings. But at the moment, due to the matchup, due to the way the Niners have played the running back position on the season, he's a little bit further back. All right, Najee Harris comes in as RB23, and ultimately he is still dealing with some knee discomfort, quote unquote, from Mike Tomlin. He's questionable at the moment, so keep an eye on Jaylen Warren. He had a season high in yards ultimately in week 10 between the ground game and the passing game. So a little bit shaky here for Najee Harris. Draws a decent matchup against the Bengals, but ultimately on the season, Najee Harris is fine in the flex, but his ceiling is just capped. The way this offense is ran, his ceiling is capped. That he has not brought those same ceilings that we saw last season. A drastic drop. He was your RB3 in full PPR last season. At the moment, he's your RB26 in full PPR, and we all know the story here. We're just not in love with starting Najee Harris. Devin Singletary had a really good week in week 10, 15.7 fantasy points by Singletary standards. That was a really good week, 47 yards on the ground and 2 touchdowns. He gets the Browns this week. Ultimately, I won't be surprised if Singletary finishes the week a little bit higher ahead of some of these other running backs we've already talked about, because the Browns have not played well against the running back position. I just have a hard time trusting Devin Singletary, so I've gotten a little bit lower on the rankings, but he could definitely have a very good week. I also have issues trusting the Ravens running back, so Gus Edwards comes in as our RB25. He's expected to be good to go here in week 11, and the Panthers have not played well against the position, but I could see Kenyon Drake getting a lot of touches. I mean, who knows? I could see Justice Hill getting touches. I just never trust the Ravens backfield because they are so volatile from a fantasy perspective, and Kenyon Drake has played really well in relief of Gus Edwards, so it's just tough to say. But if Edwards is your RB1 theoretically, he gets the Panthers, it's a good matchup. All right, Isaiah Pacheco comes in as our RB27. He's got a really good matchup against the Chargers defense. They have not played well against the running back position, although they looked a little bit better in week 10 than we expected. They've got a lot of injuries as well. So Pacheco should be your RB1 for the Chiefs. I mean, you never really know at the end of the day what Andy Reid's going to cook up. Jerick McKinnon has been playing well from a full PPR perspective with 10 or more performances in terms of fantasy in the last 2 weeks. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is, like, I think I read the most dropped player in all of fantasy football at the moment. I have no faith in him. So Pacheco should come out as your RB1. He had 82 yards on the ground in week 10, 16 touches on the ground. He was the clear-cut ground game running back, with McKinnon getting all of the passing involvement. So Pacheco, a good matchup, but we really just need to see him score some touchdowns on the season. His only touchdown on the year was week 1 against Arizona, when the Chiefs were way up in that game at the end of the game. So he's a little bit further back on the list, but he definitely has a good opportunity here in week 11. Khalil Herbert is currently questionable at the moment. He had 10 touches in week 10 against Detroit, 57 yards on the ground. I thought he would have a better week against the Lions. Didn't have that bad of a week on the ground, but just not a lot of upside from a fantasy perspective. We really need to see Herbert score touchdowns. When he does score touchdowns, he gets you like 15 or more fantasy points. When he doesn't, he gets you 2 to 5 fantasy points. So he's a little bit further back on the list, but he does have a good opportunity against the Falcons. And if he sits, that's another reason why Monty's a little bit higher on the list, because he's definitely going to be the RB1 for the week for the Bears. But a good matchup for Herbert on paper as we approach the week. Michael Carter was on bye week in week 10, but he had a good week in week 9 against Buffalo with 15.6 fantasy points, a touchdown, and 76 rushing yards. So another tough matchup here in week 11 against New England, but he played them in week 8 and had 10.1 fantasy points. So I won't be surprised if Carter actually finishes a little bit higher than some of these other running backs, but I also won't be surprised if the Patriots show up. You know, this is a game in Foxborough. Patriots are at home, so I won't be surprised if this defense shows up overall. All right, Ezekiel Elliott comes in next as RB30 overall. Once again, we don't know a true status for Zeke, who's missed the last 2 weeks, or really the last 3 weeks if you include the week 9 bye. So we're not sure if he's going to suit up in week 11. If he does, I think it limits Tony Pollard's upside, and it also is going, Tony Pollard's going to limit Ezekiel Elliott's upside. So we'll see what happens here, but he does still draw fantasy value. Between weeks 3 and 7, he had 4 double-digit fantasy performances. So he is definitely a flex option if he suits up in week 11. All right, we're going to move through the final 10 running backs fairly quickly here. Melvin Gordon is a running back I want to take a look at as well as Latavius Murray. They both have a good matchup against the Raiders in week 11, and ultimately this is a true committee. Latavius Murray, 9 touches on the ground in week 10, 3 targets. Melvin Gordon, 7 touches on the ground and 6 targets. Just a true split. Melvin Gordon is performing, I guess you could argue, a little bit better in the passing game, so he holds more PPR upside. Neither of them scored a touchdown in week 10. It was a tough matchup against Tennessee, but I do think both of them have a good opportunity against the Raiders in week 11. Looking at the rest of the Falcons running backs, I still have some faith in Tyler Algier. He had just 8 touches in week 10 for 20 yards on the ground. Ultimately, he had 3 targets, 3 receptions, but finished with negative 17 receiving yards. Really tough there. So Caleb Huntley, on the other hand, had 5 touches for 32 rushing yards, but it's just a good matchup for the Falcons running backs going up against the Bears. But I just don't know how to look at this backfield. It's more than a split committee. I mean, it is all over the place, but I still think there's a good opportunity for Patterson, Huntley, and Algier. So they all make the top 40. It just kind of depends on what the coaching staff for the Falcons decides for the week. Eli Mitchell, 9.8 fantasy points in week 10 against the Chargers, 89 yards on the ground, 18 touches like we talked about at the beginning of the video. It's the Cardinals this week. Really, at the end of the day, the deciding factor for a fantasy stat line for Mitchell is Is he going to score a touchdown or not? And how much more involvement does CMC get than Eli Mitchell? It's up to Kyle Shanahan. No matter what, on a yearly basis, Kyle Shanahan is going to Shanahan you when it comes to the running backs on his team from a fantasy perspective. James Robinson had 13.3 fantasy points in week 9 against Buffalo, had a receiving touchdown and 48 yards on the ground. Draws a steep matchup against the Patriots, just like Michael Carter. But James Robinson, if you are struggling for a flex option for the week, I think is someone to take a look at in deeper leagues especially. But we'll see how that split continues to look as the season progresses. Damian Harris, if he is able to suit up, he did not suit up in weeks 9 or 10, is still a decent option against the Jets. Once again, really when we're looking at these final 10 running backs, we've got a lot of committees, a lot of split backfields, and even some handcuffed players who kind of, their overall production is dependent on the other running back on their respective roster, and that includes AJ Dillon. If Aaron Jones is not good to go in week 11 against Tennessee Titans, and you could fire up AJ Dillon in the flex, but it's not a good matchup. But he did have 65 yards on the ground, his second best rushing performance of the year in week 10 against the Dallas Cowboys. And if Jones is out, Dillon is your clear-cut RB1 for the Packers, so he could gain some value. All right, Kareem Hunt definitely depends on, A, does he score a touchdown, and B, what does Nick Chubb do for the day? And I'm going to bet on Nick Chubb. Kareem Hunt, one of the most frustrating running backs in all of fantasy football. He is a pure handcuff in my eyes. Like, you just can't trust Kareem Hunt on a weekly basis. In week 8, he had 11.2 fantasy points, a bye week in week 9. Then in week 10, he had 2.9 fantasy points. You cannot trust Kareem Hunt. He's not even scoring that many touchdowns on the year. Some of these higher fantasy stat lines are purely coming from his receiving work, and then everything else is coming from if he does score a touchdown. So I just don't trust Hunt. But at the end of the day, there's always an opportunity for him to have double-digit fantasy points. There's always an opportunity for him to have single-digit fantasy performances as well. Kenyon Drake is going to wrap up the list for me because I do think he could still see enough touches to make him relevant. Or he could see all the touches. I don't know. I mean, I'll be honest. I never know what to do with the Ravens running backs. I absolutely despise them from a fantasy perspective. We could see Gus Edwards get the bulk of the carries. We could see Kenyon Drake get the bulk of the carries. We could see them split. We could see Justice Hill get involved. We could see neither of them get involved. I mean, so at the end of the day, it's a good matchup for Kenyon Drake. He has played very well in the last 2 weeks in relief of Gus Edwards. I think he definitely deserves to make the top 40 as we approach week 11. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.